Plonsey, for coming out and speaking to me for In the Field, which is our Outsound program that we talk to artists who are performing at the Outsound New Music Summit every year.
All right.
And, we usually like to get started out with a little bit of introduction of, like, say, what were your beginnings? Your first instruments? What was it that drew you to music?
You know, it's weird. I was just talking to a guy that I run into frequently when I walk my dog about that this morning, and he was asking me. He asked me the exact same question, which I hadn't been asked in, I don't know, forever. And I couldn't really remember, but I started playing clarinet when I was like in first grade because they wouldn't let me play a saxophone because I was too small, they said, for a saxophone. But the weird thing is I don't know what saxophone music I could possibly have been listening to. The only record that I can think of was this like child's introduction to the instruments of the orchestra where they sang songs about each one of the orchestral instruments and then included the saxophone, and there's this song, I Max the Saxophone. Do you know that?
No.
I Max the Saxophone. Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. And, you know, and then the guy takes a little, like a very timid little saxophone solo.
Sure.
Because my parents didn't listen to jazz really. We had maybe 2 or 3 jazz records. Like Leonard Bernstein introduces jazz.
Right.
They're into classical music.
So you listen to a lot of classical music.
So I listen to classical music, show tunes, folk music when I was little. But I loved music. I mean, I loved listening to whatever.
Sure.
But I didn't really start listening to jazz until after I started playing, like in high school, stage band and that kind of thing.
And where did you grow up?
Cleveland Heights, Ohio.
Okay. Yeah. That's a really important state for a lot of music that we love now too. You know, in terms of a lot of players who were innovating came out of Cleveland.
Well, you know, Albert Eiler was one suburb over in Shaker Heights, although he was gone by the time I.
And Roland Kirk.
Kirk.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And then there's some rock bands. Para Ubu is from Cleveland. Devo's from nearby.
Right.
And you know, it's an interesting city.
Did you get a chance as you were growing up to experience the local music scene when you were there?
You know, the thing about Cleveland in those days was it was actually quite conservative, and like the local classical music station had a policy of never playing anything written after 1950, and the Cleveland Orchestra, you know, great orchestra, but they didn't play anything modern. There were a couple jazz musicians I subsequently learned about, but there wasn't really much of a scene. And I think there's something happening now, but I've been gone for years. So, you know, it was mostly just hanging out with my friends, and there were some really excellent music stores. And as it happens, I live not that far from the comic book writer Harvey Pekar, and right near where he lived, there was a street that had a couple great record stores. So I was able to get the music I'd heard of by the time I kind of got interested in late high school and college when I'd come home over the summer. So
a lot of listening.
Records. And there was a great radio station, WRUW, that came out of Case Western Reserve
they're still
University. And they're still around, and they still play good music. So I heard a lot on there. But it was much more recorded than live. I did see Duke Ellington once when I was like 10 or 11 or something.
Really?
But, you know, then like Maynard Ferguson came to our high school and played, and Stan Kenton. So that's, you know, I was kind of into, you know, big band music.
Right, exactly.
You know, it's fast and it's bright and it's loud and it's, you know.
Right. Yeah, for kids cool. it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely.
So that begs the question, what was it that brought you into creative music in as we are in our current state of what we're doing at the summit and what you've been doing for many decades now?
Yeah.
You know, were there artists or?
It was really going to college, and I had a roommate freshman year who was a composer whose favorite composer was Stockhausen, but he also listened to Mauricio Kagel. He listened to all the avant-garde. He listened to, John Cage, Penderecki, and so I got into that music first, and then I'd been reading about, there's this avant-garde side of jazz I know nothing about, and of all people, it was like in a Leonard Feather book that I read about Pat Patrick. I was looking up baritone saxophones because I played the baritone sax.
Oh, you did?
And I knew Pepper Adams, and I really loved him, and I knew Jerry Mulligan, and I loved him. And then I read about Pat Patrick, and I said, okay, I guess I got to pick up, what's he on? Oh, he plays with Sun Ra. Oh, okay. So I went back to Cleveland, and I got The Magic City, as it happens. And when I first listened to it, I think this might have been still in high school, I just got so upset that I threw the record across the room. I literally threw the record across the room. I don't think I even put it back in its sleeve before throwing it. But fortunately it didn't break, and I just sort of shelved it. And then I remember, after a semester of listening to Stockhausen and Kagel and Messiaen and all these guys, I came home and I thought, maybe I should give that record another try. And that was really the moment. It's like, okay, this is what I've been looking for. And it was right there, because I'd been listening to music that had no tempo, no key, electronic music, and stuff that you really had to listen to very carefully to make any sense out of, at all. Improvised music, like Stockhausen did these sort of so-called intuitive music, which had these, I don't know if you know those scores, they're just like instructions.
I've heard of them, yeah.
Like play in the rhythm of the universe. And then play in the rhythm of, just sort of these kind of
amorphous
instructions, which, could mean anything. And so when Sun Ra veered into, like the Magic City, the title track is like 25 minutes of conducted improvisation. And it was on the instruments that I loved, and there was some remnants of jazz in it. And so within a few months I was looking for more of his records, and then the orchestra played in Boston, and that's when I first saw them. Drove up to Boston.
When was that? Remember?
This would have been 77, 78, I can't remember. And then after my junior year in college, I went to the Creative Music Studios in Woodstock, New York, which at that time it was founded, I don't know who founded it exactly, but Carl Berger, I believe, with Don Cherry and Ornette Coleman. And the summer that I was there, Carl Berger was there because he was always there, and Roscoe Mitchell was there the whole time, and then other people came in and left. Leo Smith, Braxton, George Lewis. It was this AACM themed summer.
Right.
So I got to study with those guys a bit, and
so you got to interact and play as well.
Yeah. And that took a little getting used to. Like their approach was not, because even though I was listening to kind of out jazz, I still thought like a classical musician, because that was my training. There was notes, and you put them on paper, and a quarter note meant a quarter note. And there's this guy who came in from Detroit, Spencer Bearfield, who ended up like playing guitar with Roscoe Mitchell. We played his music, and you would play the rhythm he'd written, but he didn't mean that rhythm. He had to play something else. Then Leo Smith was like, he would notate. He had the system where the number of flags on a note, so the 8th note has one flag, 16th has two flags, meant you could replace that note with any other note. And if it had two flags, you could replace it with two notes. 3 flags, 3 notes. If it was dotted, that meant
so he
more
changed
notes.
The notation system.
So it meant nothing. It was just like you could replace, he would write a piece, but you could replace any of his notes with any notes of your choosing, and then after us trying that for a bit, he said, yeah, or you could replace it with a phrase, one phrase or two phrases. And it's like, well, then what does this have to do with anything? Like, what's this notation? So it took me sometime, and Braxton came in, and he had these graphic scores, and he made us interpret them in different ways, like, the obvious one was like if the line went up, then your pitch went up. But he wasn't even interested in that. Like, he had us just moving in our chairs so that when the line went up, everyone had to go up like this, and that, following the score, and using also the graph for some other parameters. And he just got really excited, and I remember him yelling for Roscoe Mitchell to come in to see this, and I remember Roscoe Mitchell just standing there with his arms folded, not registering any emotion whatsoever. While Anthony was just like, whoa, very excited about this.
Very different approaches.
Very different people.
Yes.
But it took me a while to get used to either of them. Like, Roscoe had written this head that was called, I think it was just called Rhythm. What was it called? But it was rhythm changes. It was just like eighth note, this sort of eighth note arpeggiating kind of line over rhythm changes.
He's well known for that, actually.
And then he had transposed it into all 12 keys.
Right.
And so, he could say, okay, now we're going to play it in A, and the saxophonists would say, okay, we need the F sharp version. So everyone had all 12 keys, so it was easy for the transposing instruments. And we would just play through this thing.
Wow.
And then he was writing one of those pieces where he would write fragments of music on little cards, and you would have to switch instruments. Like every 3 notes, you'd switch to a different instrument. And he ended up writing a piece, expressly, like he found out what instruments everyone played. And so sort of this personalized little piece.
So this sounds like it was quite a profound experience for you.
Yeah, and
your first.
And a lot of things were counterintuitive. As I'm saying, like, and the kinds of improvisations that that he liked. Like, they would put together little trios, and you'd play, and then they would sometimes give a remark or two. And it wasn't always obvious to me what he would like and what he wouldn't like. And the same for the other composers there. They liked things that were not, where the relationships weren't very obvious. They didn't like obvious stuff.
Were these open to the public as well, or were they educational workshops?
They were workshops. This was conducted on this kind of former summer camp. And there were a few people who kind of lived nearby and who would sometimes stop in and be involved. Like, that guy Kramer, who ended up playing in Shockabilly with Eugene Chadbourne, and he's a producer. He lived nearby in a trailer, and he'd sometimes show up. And there was who else would show up? There are other people who would just kind of now and then show up, but otherwise it was about 25 people.
Right. It wasn't like a retreat.
Yeah, you had to pay money, but they had scholarships. I think they got grants and stuff. So there was some sort of application process.
Right.
Tom Dill was there.
Oh.
So that's where I met Tom Dill.
Okay. Dan
Siemens was my roommate. That's where I met Dan.
Okay. Yeah, he's here.
Tina Marsh of the Creative Opportunity Orchestra was there. Mars Williams, who was in Chicago, played with Hal Russell, and now I think is playing with the Psychedelic Furs, among other things.
Right.
Who else was there who turned up? Other people were there who turned up later.
Right. And how long did these workshops last? Did you go to more than one, or?
It was like a 5-week workshop that I went to.
Right.
Tom had been there for much longer. They had things that went on through the year.
Ah, yes.
And Tom did that, and he ended up making some money copying scores for Braxton.
So this was like the late 70s, right?
This was 78, 79,
Right.
79.
And you were playing other music as well in conjunction with free music, or were you just, this was your total focus?
Yeah, like in college, I played in the jazz ensemble, which was led by this guy named David Mott, which was a fairly forward-looking ensemble. Jane Ira Bloom was the lead alto at the time, and some other people who went on to do other things. So it was, semi-experimental big band.
Oh, so
people wrote charts for it.
Integrating from your experiences and going back into like the larger more traditional ensembles they were still experimenting too. It seems like it was happening in conjunction for you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have to say I was more involved with the people I knew. I always felt like I was by far the worst person in the jazz band, and I definitely was. And so it didn't even really occur to me to write any pieces for them, or I didn't hang out with those guys that much.
Yeah.
I hung out instead with the kind of experimental composers.
Right. Were you composing at the same time?
Yeah, so I had started composing, and I wrote an alto saxophone quartet really inspired by Roscoe Mitchell's Nonea, and then I wrote some other pieces that were, let's see, what else? Some that were sort of conceptual, inspired by Yoko Ono. And then I wrote a string quartet because I had a friend who played cello, and he was in a quartet.
Right.
You end up doing that kind of thing, like from the beginning.
And this was in Cleveland?
No, this was in college.
Oh, in college? Where were you?
I was at Yale.
Oh, okay. See,
so
we missed that part.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So, in retrospect, I don't know. I mean, I was pretty shy, and there were people around, like, what's his name? George Lewis, I think, was still living in town, and Anthony Davis, the piano player, who's the Ives player? Dwight Andrews, very good saxophonist. So there was this sort of creative music community, small community in New Haven, and there's a place or two where they played.
Sure.
And I would go to see concerts. Mark Helias was around, and Ray Anderson, the trombonist, and Braxton's drummer for many years in the quartet. Why am I spacing on his name? He was there. So those people were there, and I saw their concerts, but I was too shy to ask if I could play with them. So, it's
but you were working with musicians in the local community that you were going to school with, and
so that's who I was working with.
Yeah, because your compositional styles, I found, at least for this area here in the Bay Area, relatively unique. I'm starting to piece together what you're telling me, where you're saying you have classical background in conjunction with early experiences of Stockhausen and later experiences of all the improvisers from like AACM and so forth. It makes sense more to me now as to why you compose the music that you compose. Could you describe how your musical compositional elements are created at this point?
Evolved.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Cause
so
we're going to be able to hear this at Summit. So.
Yeah, because there's still like a big step from there to here. So in the classical world, the guy that I really fixated on was Charles Ives, who himself was from New Haven, went to Yale, and was an outsider his whole life.
Sure.
What I got from him was, by the time I was in college, serialism was kind of on its way out. Minimalism was getting to be pretty strong. I was pretty into the minimalists, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, and Philip Glass, and I never liked the serialists. So what I got from Ives was that it didn't really make sense. What I decided about serial music is the structures that they were doing with the 12 notes were completely beyond my hearing. I couldn't hear what they were doing. Whereas like Ives' structure, because he was working with putting melody, like he was using larger units, the unit of the melody. So, you know, you could have this melody going against that melody. And that you could hear, you know, because your ear could follow this melody, your ear could follow that melody. Like when I heard Nan Carroll later, like it's the same sort of thing when he does his canons. You know, you can hear the structure even when it gets pretty complex because it's melody against melody. And I like that idea of multiple voices, you know, playing melodies at the same time, which kind of is what happens in improvisation a lot of the time.
Sure.
Like everyone thinks of themselves as playing the melody. And Braxton used to say that too, you know. I think it was Braxton.
I'm sure he talked
all
about
those
it.
guys. Yeah, I mean, it was just like Leo Smith, like the way he justified that he didn't expect you to transpose. It was like, you know, why do the C instruments not have to transpose? Why did just the B flat instruments? It's like he saw it almost as like this sort of civil rights issue that right. You know, someone's calling on him to transpose. Like, why should he have to adjust? You're so right. It's like everyone gets to play the melody.
Sure.
Right? Everyone gets the melody. And Ornette, of course, maybe it was Ornette. I'm thinking it actually all this time.
Yeah. So
Ornette and his idea, you know, you think of everyone as a melody instrument, and that's kind of how I started writing music. Like, you didn't have a bass part that was just going dun, 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 dun.
Sure.
Because, you know, everyone should get to play melodically.
Right.
So my earlier pieces were more like that, more polyphonic. Like there'd be multiple things happening at once, and I need to get back to writing some of that music. It was sort of promising, but then I don't know what happened. I came out here, and I kind of had the idea of simplifying my style for some reason. And I'm not really sure exactly where that came from, but most of my recent music doesn't have multiple melodies. You know, it's a little bit more traditional in some ways.
But it has multiple rhythms.
It has multiple rhythms.
Yeah. I was just thinking this because you're saying, you know, there's this polyrhythmic elements in your music. Very continuous, it appears. You know? Yeah. And it goes on for quite some time, which I also found intriguing.
You know, yeah, and it goes on for some time. Yeah.
There's no rest for the performers at all,
right?
In your music, which is interesting because you don't see that as very often.
See, I think that I also got from Braxton, but also from Morton Feldman. Just this idea, like I heard Morton Feldman speak at one point, and this is very inspirational. Like he's just such a crazy guy, and everything he said seemed really meaningful, but I couldn't, in the end, really figure out what he meant by any of it. Although what he did say is, his method for writing is he just writes this, and then he writes that, and he just keeps on working with the material he has until he's done with it, you know.
Sure.
And you just keep on, you don't stop until you've tried every possible permutation. And so that idea of trying to take a small amount of music and turn it into something long, I think I got from him. But then also from like Braxton's Ghost Trance music, where it's just this 1 hour long or 2 hour long piece.
Right, exactly.
Just the challenge of that. It seemed like a good challenge, and it seemed like certain decisions that I've made according to the dictum of just because something sounds difficult or impossible doesn't mean that that's why you should do it. You come up with some idea and then you're like, no, that's crazy, don't do that. And that's too simple, too obvious, too whatever. No, those are the ideas you should go with. That I kind of owe to Pauline Oliveros, who I took a course with at Mills, and she assigned us the task of writing a piece that was impossible. And she didn't really make it clear what that even meant.
Well, why would she? It's impossible.
Right. So that was one of my first really large pieces, and I wrote a long melody for it.
Mm.
I think I'd written a long melody kind of in honor of my childhood dog who died, and I just written this really long melody that was very simple, and I just thought, you want to write a melody for a dog, it can't be too complicated, and it should somehow evoke a dog, and then since then I've stuck with that idea of writing long melodies and trying to evoke a kind of animal nature, which in many ways is less contrived. I just feel like it's a way to the unconscious that's much better than trying to be too clever. Like being clever, I think, is the worst thing that can happen to a composer, right? Like, we know this, right?
Yes.
We've seen, there's way too many
I'm very
really
aware of
clever
that.
people who make really awful music.
That's very
like
true.
that's really maybe one of the most important things I took out of my experience in academia was the music here is awful. This is unimaginably bad. I remember going to one concert, at Yale, and I just I had to finally leave. I couldn't stop laughing. It's just, the kind of music that, like, one piece after another, these graduate composers concerts, that horrible stuff,
right.
just torturous. And so I think that was, just thinking this through some more, go for simplicity, animal nature.
Sports?
Well, the sports, like, where did that... No,
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So I started doing the season pieces.
Yeah.
And I do like sports, but I don't really watch sports on TV or even go to very many games. So the first season piece, and it wasn't going to be like I was going to do a bunch of season pieces at the time. It was just, okay, it's going to be baseball season.
Right.
I'd written this little, like, da 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 da. And then I just repeated that a bunch of times, and then I kind of closed my eyes, and I kind of put some splotches on the paper, and every place there was a splotch, I changed the notes. So instead of repeating verbatim,
right.
each time it was slightly different, and there would
Sure.
be like a little mistake in it.
Right.
And
You did like football season, soccer season, or
no, hockey season.
Hockey season.
Yeah. And then there's Cavity season.
Okay.
So
Right.
each of the season pieces is based on a very simple idea, musical idea that just repeats, but in different ways. Like hockey
Right.
season, it's harmonized differently each time, and there's these intermittent like fights break out. There's these like little improvisations
Right,
that happen frequently.
Spontaneously,
So-
without any prediction.
Yeah. But baseball scene, I mean, the reason that one happened is just that I'd been looking at a bunch of box scores, and you look at, they're all exactly the same, except, this one has some ones where that one has some zeros and some twos and some threes. But like on paper, baseball just looks incredibly boring, and I just thought, you could go through a season's worth of baseball games, and they're all slightly different. Like if you went to the games, they'd be, more significantly different. But if you're just looking at the box scores and flipping through, so it seemed like that's what. So that piece wasn't really about baseball at all. It was really
Right.
about baseball box scores and how
Sure.
similar they all are.
Right.
And it seemed to suit the form. And then later on, I thought, I'll try to do some other ideas. Like football season, I wrote about a dozen short motifs, and I just started cycling them. Like in the first section, you hear A, B, C, and D. Then in the second section, you hear still a little bit of A, B, C, and then E comes in. And then, so each of the 8 sections I introduce
Right.
1 or 2 more motifs and phase out some of the earlier ones. And that kind of structure is something that comes back all kinda in the piece we're going to play. We're finally to the present.
Right. See, right.
So for this piece, which is called On His Shoulders Stands No One, I guess I have to consider it a season piece, even though there's no word season in it. They usually have season in them.
A solo sport, perhaps.
But it's the same idea. It's like I basically wrote a melody that gets sort of progressively more atonal, and it's just in eighth notes and quarter notes, like da 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 da. Starts out more or less in C major, and then more and more accidentals, and the leaps get larger, and then it kind of calms down again near the end. And I wrote the melody, I don't know, some dozen years ago, and I kind of came upon it as I was looking through some old notebooks, and I titled it back then, so I'm not entirely sure what I meant by the title. But my idea for it was, okay, we'll sort of gradually work our way through this melody. I'll play the first 4 bars, then I'll start again the next time the note C happens. So every time the note C happens, there's another 4-bar chunk that we play, and they're overlapping chunks. And it works its way through to the end of the piece, and so it's a way of turning something like 5 minutes of music into
a full set.
The full set, which could go. We're going to try to keep it at 45 minutes for this show, but it could go an hour if the repetitions were 4 times instead of 2 times in some places. And there'll be improvisations periodically.
Right.
And it will be the most polyphonic of these recent pieces in that there'll be 3 saxophones, each of whom is playing the first person, okay, suppose the first person's playing the beginning of the melody, the first 4 bars. The second person starts the second time the note C occurs. So it's effectively in canon. They're playing the same thing, but maybe 5 or 6 notes ahead. And then the third person is on the third C, so maybe they're 12 notes ahead. And so for each section, though, that relationship changes. So there's some where you hear really clearly that they're each playing the same thing, but starting a little bit ahead. And other times it's not so obvious. It's just kind of this more kind of modal thing. And then while that's going on, there's a violin and a piano that kind of pick out certain pitches to kind of emphasize, and I don't know, it just seemed like it needed something more than just those saxophones. And then there's a bass that also, so the bass, the violin, and the piano kind of have the role of just echoing some of the notes.
Right.
And then there's drums.
So you're involving actually polyphonic and polyrhythmic elements.
Yeah.
An amalgamation of things we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, like the bass part it's a lot of dotted quarters, so lots of, like, it's 3-ish, and the drum part's very 2-ish.
Great.
And the violin has these long notes interspersed with like da 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 dee da 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 dee dee da 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 da.
Wow.
So each note has, each instrument kind of has its own role. I'm a little worried about it.
Excellent. Very good.
We haven't had our first rehearsal. I've been practicing a lot because the saxophone parts are hard.
Yeah. Of course.
So, but harder than I know football season was also hard for me.
Yeah.
But that one I didn't practice that much. I should have practiced it much more.
Well, we always like to present surprises and debuts, and you're going to be offering up both this year.
Yeah. So I'm sure it'll be good. We'll find some way to convince the audience that it's what we intended.
The good news is that you're not giving them any time to get up and leave because it's a full piece with no breaks.
There's no breaks.
Perfect.
That's right. I don't know. There are places where it kind of thins out, and there's just a couple people playing, but
very good.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't, these long pieces, I presented only one of them, because all of these season pieces are like an hour long, and there's only one that's been played live, and it was years ago, and it was, I don't know, it's weird. Like, you've done some long pieces.
Sure, yeah.
It's like,
2 45-minute sets, in fact, last year, so yes.
Right.
Right.
It has its own difficulties for the performer, and the audience I'm not so worried about, because I feel like, I can't possibly expect you, the audience, to listen all the way through really carefully you're going to zone out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's fine, you know.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
and then it becomes background possibly for 15 minutes. And then,
Right.
you know, then you tune back in and then you tune out again. And that's kind of the thing about long music. It's intended that way.
Right.
You know, there's super long music where the audience is supposed to get up and leave and go away and have dinner
Sure.
and come back, and they're still
Right.
going on all night long. And
Lamont Young comes.
Lamont Young, or
Yeah.
those early Terry Riley things, or the
Yeah.
Balinese.
Yes, the gamelan.
Gamelan, yeah.
Mhm.
Shadow puppet plays that go on all, you know. And, you know, and it's... So, you know, I don't expect people to necessarily listen intently with the same kind of focus. And I don't know, I don't mind that myself when I go to concerts. I don't mind that there's... You don't want every single concert to go on for a full set with no breaks, but
No.
it happens now and then.
It does.
And we can deal with it.
Yeah.
And we can enjoy it even. I hope. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure it'll be quite enjoyable to find.
Well, we'll see. I mean, you know, the title is a little bit worrisome. Like I explained that, I think.
But in our promotional material, we explain you've explained the piece and how where it comes from. So it's as opposed to just the title being. If it stood alone, it might be a little confusing. But you described what it was all about in a general purpose.
Right. I mean, you know, I don't know where the title even really came from.
Sure.
It's possible some of my titles. Especially, I tend to do a lot of the composing sort of later at night, and I sometimes start getting sleepy, and sometimes a phrase will pop into my head. You know, those sorts of phrases, and you write those down. And it's possible that this came from that, though my rationale, of course, is like on his shoulders stands no one. You know, we all stand on the shoulders of giants, but not on his shoulders. There's no one standing on his shoulders.
Not yet, at least. Right?
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. I look forward to your debut on July 26th
26th
at the Community Music Center at our 15th annual Outsound Music Center.
Wow, 15.
15 years.
Oh, very cool.
So
yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah.
This is
It'll be the opening night of the concerts. So
yeah.
that'd be great.
John Sherba's piece. His piece was one long piece.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, that I didn't mind. That was a good
Tom
piece.
Dill's piece was a long piece too.
Oh, yeah.
1 year too. So it's not uncommon for us to present this kind of music.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Good. So people are kind of used to it. They've
We'll
had
see.
15 years of it.
we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, I hope they'll be there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, and I
Oh
appreciate
yeah,
talking
thank you.
to
It's really fun to have
Great.
an opportunity to just talk and talk.
All right. Thank you.